In the summer of 1988, the driest in 112 years of record-keeping for Union County, New Mexico, the fate of 983 souls and their 20,000 head of cattle came to rest on 40 swaybacked mules and a man the county had long since dismissed as a relic. The man was Hiram Stone. He was 78 years old. And what he proposed to do was not considered a solution. It was considered the final, rambling act of a man whose time had passed. Let me tell you about Hiram Stone. He was born in 1910 in the same clapboard house he lived in now, a house built by his grandfather with ponderosa pine hauled down from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in 1889. He stood 5 feet and 7 inches tall, had weighed 145 pounds since the end of the Great War, and was known for 2 things. He never wore a new hat, and he never wasted a word. He had worked the same 1,200-acre ranch his entire life, a life that had seen the transition from horse to tractor, from ditch irrigation to center pivot, from trusting the sky to drilling into the earth. His hands were maps of barbed wire cuts, rope burns, and the deep, permanent creases of labor. He had buried a wife, raised a son who died in Korea, and now lived with the quiet company of his memories and his animals. And then there were the mules. They were not a handsome lot. They were the cast-offs, the rejects, the animals that modern ranching had no use for. Hiram had acquired them over 20 years, 1 or 2 at a time, from auctions in Clayton and Amarillo. He never paid more than $200 for one. Most were over the age of 15. They were Jennets and Johns of indeterminate lineage with names like Ruth and Ishmael and Lazarus. Their backs dipped in the middle, their ears were often torn, and their dispositions ranged from cantankerous to merely stubborn. To his neighbors, they were a curiosity, a herd of living antiques that consumed nearly $1,200 a month in feed and produced nothing. They were Hiram's folly. The other ranchers in the Cimarron Valley were modern men. They were men like Bill McCrae, 52 years old, who ran 3,000 acres and had a line of credit with the First National Bank of Clayton that ran to 6 figures. They drove Ford F-250s with diesel engines. Their wells were drilled to a depth of 350, sometimes 400 feet, pulling water from the Ogallala Aquifer with 15 horsepower submersible pumps that cost $8,000 to replace and ran up an electric bill of $900 a month, even in a good year. They trusted computer-generated weather forecasts, futures markets, and the advice of agricultural extension agents. They were good men, hard-working men, who saw Hiram's 40 mules as a sad emblem of a past they had wisely escaped. They would see him on the county road, his old Dodge pickup loaded with hay, and they would shake their heads. "A nice old man," they'd say. "A shame he's so stuck." The problem began not as a crisis, but as a series of quiet, unsettling numbers. The winter of 1987 had seen only 42 inches of snow, less than a third of the average. The spring rains, which usually arrived in late April, never came. By June 1st, the Clayton weather station had recorded only 11 inches of precipitation for the year, a deficit of 78 inches. The Cimarron River, which was really just a wide, sandy creek most years, was bone dry. The grasses on the plains, the grama and the bluestem, cured to a brittle brown before they had a chance to grow. The ranchers started feeding hay in May, something usually reserved for the dead of winter. The cost of a bale went from $250 to $400, then to $550. On June 15th, the County Water Board held an emergency meeting in the high school gymnasium. The man at the podium was Carl Jessup. He was 42 years old, had a master's degree in hydrology from Texas A&M, and was a consultant hired by the county for precisely this kind of situation. He was a confident man who wore crisp khaki shirts and spoke in the reassuring language of data. He had charts and graphs projected onto a screen behind him. One graph showed the water level in the Ogallala Aquifer. It was a stark, downward-sloping line. "Folks," Jessup began, his voice amplified by the crackling PA system, "the situation is critical. The recharge rate for the aquifer is effectively 0 right now. We are drawing down a finite resource at an unsustainable pace." He pointed to another chart. "Based on our models, at the current rate of agricultural and municipal draw, wells under 300 feet will begin to go intermittent within 60 days. Wells under 400 feet will follow by September. A murmur went through the crowd of 200 ranchers and townspeople. They sat on the folding wooden chairs, their faces grim, the smell of dust and worry rising in the hot, still air of the gym. Jessup laid out the plan. Stage 1. Immediate mandatory water rationing. No watering loans. Agricultural users must cut consumption by 30%. Stage 2. If things didn't improve in 30 days. A 50% cut. He spoke of applying for federal disaster relief, of setting up a subsidized water hauling program, and of the long-term solution. A new municipal well, drilled to 1,200 feet, at a projected cost of $42 million, to be funded by a 30-year county bond. This is the responsible path forward, he concluded, his tone leaving no room for argument. We have to manage the resource we have while planning for a more resilient future. When he asked for questions, a hand went up in the back. It was Hiram Stone. He didn't stand. He just raised his hand, and the room, out of a kind of collective, slightly embarrassed respect for his age, fell quiet. Jessup squinted. Yes, Mr. Stone. Hiram's voice was raspy but clear. It carried without the need for a microphone. He said, "What about the old trace?" Jessup looked confused. "The what, sir?" "The old Spanish trace. The cattle path. It leads to the Ojo Caliente Seco. There's water there." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Bill McCrae, sitting in the front row, shook his head almost imperceptibly. Carl Jessup gave a tight, professional smile. "Mr. Stone, I've reviewed all the geological surveys and historical water maps for this county. The Ojo Caliente Seco, as you call it, is listed as an intermittent seep. This flow rate, even in wet years, is negligible. Certainly not enough to make a difference for a valley this size. Furthermore," he added, tapping a map on his projector, "any path to it would be across 7 miles of the most rugged terrain in the county. It's not a feasible source." Hiram said nothing more. He just lowered his hand. The answer had been given. The expert had spoken. The meeting moved on to discussions of rationing schedules and the legalities of the bond issue. Hiram Stone slipped out the side door before it was over. The consensus in the gym was that the old man was probably getting a little senile. It was sad to see. Let me tell you about the old Spanish trace, because it's the heart of this story. It wasn't a road. It wasn't even a trail in the modern sense. It was a memory etched into the land. Its origins were older than any map. The Jicarilla Apache had used it first, a path that followed the contours of the land, never fighting the terrain, always seeking the path of least resistance from the high plains down into the sheltered coves of the dry Cimarron Canyon. In the 1700s, the Spanish colonists had widened it, using it to drive their wiry longhorn cattle, Las Vacas Flacas, the skinny cows, up to the summer grasses. It was a drought trail. The longhorns were tough enough to make the journey, and the path led to one of the only water sources that was said to never fail, a spring that emerged not from the aquifer below, but from a deep geological fault, forced to the surface by subterranean pressure. The spring was called Ojo Caliente Seco, the hot dry spring. Contradiction in terms. It was called Seco because it was in the heart of the driest part of the canyon, and Caliente because the water emerged from the earth at a constant 68 degrees, feeling warm in winter and cool in summer. The trace was engineered with an almost imperceptible, continuous downward gradient of 15 degrees. This was crucial. It meant that water, if it could be made to flow, would travel the entire 78 miles from the spring to the valley floor by the force of gravity alone. But the trace hadn't been used in a century. The coming of the railroad in the 1880s made the long cattle drives obsolete. Barbed wire, invented in 1874, carved up the open range. And then, the discovery of the Ogallala Aquifer made the trace irrelevant. Why walk cattle 7 miles to water when you could drill a hole and have it gush out of the ground? The path became overgrown with cholla and juniper. A flash flood in 1954 had caused a massive rockslide, burying a 300-yard section of it under thousands of tons of basalt and shale. The trace was forgotten, a piece of folklore. It existed only in the memory of the oldest men, and most clearly in the mind of Hiram Stone, whose grandfather had been one of the last men to drive cattle along it. The day after the meeting, Hiram drove his Dodge to the county clerk's office. He spent 3 hours poring over old plat maps from the 1890s, the paper yellow and brittle. He confirmed what he already knew. The entire length of the old trace was on public land, a designated right-of-way that had never been officially decommissioned. It was a public road, even if the public had forgotten it existed. He made a copy of the map for 25 cents. That afternoon, he started his work. He didn't make an announcement. He didn't ask for permission. He simply hitched his 2 oldest, steadiest mules, Ishmael and Ahab, to a heavy-duty brush hog he'd adapted to be pulled by a team. He loaded a water barrel, a toolbox, and his lunch, 2 hard-boiled eggs and a piece of cornbread wrapped in wax paper, into the bed of his truck. He drove to the head of the valley where the forgotten trace began, unloaded the mules, and set to work clearing the thick brush. The sound of it was foreign in the modern valley. The jingle of harnessed chains, the soft plod of hooves in the dust, and Hiram's low, quiet commands. "Gee, Ishmael. Haw. Ahab. Easy now." Bill McRae drove by that first day. He slowed his new Ford, the air conditioning whispering inside the cab. He saw Hiram, sweat staining the back of his faded blue work shirt, walking behind the mules as the brush hog chewed through the dense mesquite. McRae shook his head and drove on. When he got to the co-op for feed, he told the men sitting around the loading dock what he'd seen. "Hiram's finally lost it," he said, not with malice, but with a kind of weary sadness. "He's out there trying to clear the old trace. With those mules." The men laughed. Not cruel laughter, but the laughter of sensible men who knew a fool's errand when they saw one. The story spread through the valley. Hiram's folly had a new chapter. For the first 3 weeks, Hiram worked alone. From sunup to sundown, 6 days a week. He cleared the brush from the first 2 miles of the trace. It was slow, grueling work in the relentless heat, which now climbed over 100 degrees every afternoon. The valley was browning and crisping. The first wells began to falter. You could hear it in the sound of the pumps. They would surge, then gasp as they pulled in air. The rationing was in full effect. People's lawns died. The town's swimming pool was closed. The mood was turning from worried to grim. Carl Jessup was busy. He was on the phone constantly with state and federal agencies. He held more meetings, presenting more charts. The bond issue was scheduled for a vote. The cost of hauling water from the municipal supply in Clayton, 40 miles away, was calculated at 12 cents a gallon. For a rancher like Bill McRae, who needed 3,000 gallons a day just for his cattle, that was $360 a day. An impossible sum. Around the 1st of July, Hiram's grandnephew, Eli, came home from college. Eli was 22, studying agricultural business at New Mexico State. He was a product of the modern world. He believed in spreadsheets, efficiency, and return on investment. He loved his great-uncle, but he was embarrassed. His friends were asking him if the old man was okay. Eli drove out to the trace to confront him. He found Hiram taking a midday break, sitting in the shade of a juniper, sharing a piece of his cornbread with one of the mules. The air was thick with the smell of dust and hot pine. "Uncle Hiram," Eli said, standing over him, "what are you doing?" Hiram looked up. He finished chewing his mouthful of cornbread before he answered, "Clearing the path." "But why?" Jessup said, "The spring is useless. Everyone thinks you're crazy." Hiram didn't get angry. He just looked at Eli with his pale blue eyes. He said, "Jessup is a smart man. He knows a lot about hydrology. He knows about computer models and aquifers. But his knowledge is wide and thin, like a sheet of water in a flash flood. It makes a big show, but it runs off quick and it's gone." He patted the dusty neck of the mule beside him. "My knowledge," he said, "is narrow and deep, like a well. Comes from one place, but it's been here a long time. My grandfather told me about this spring. He said it wasn't about the flow. It was about the source. The aquifer is like a savings account. Everyone's been drawing from it for 50 years and nobody's made a deposit. This spring is different. It's not from the savings account. It's from somewhere else. Somewhere deep. It doesn't matter if the flow is small. What matters is that it doesn't stop. Eli was frustrated. But that's just a story, Uncle Hiram. Jessup has data. Hiram nodded slowly. He does. He has a lot of data about how things have been for the last 50 years. He doesn't have any data about how things were before that. He looked down the 2 miles of cleared path, a pale scar on the brown landscape. He looked up at the miles of tangled rock and brush that remained. He said, "Your data can't tell you what it doesn't know." He stood up, his joints creaking. "But a mule can. These animals, they're not built for speed. They're built for patience. They can work all day in this heat on a bucket of oats and a little water. They won't overheat like a tractor. They won't break an axle on these rocks. They're the right tool for the job. And this is the job." Eli didn't know what to say. He came to argue, to convince his uncle to stop this embarrassing spectacle. But he found himself listening. Hiram pointed to a set of heavy iron scoops lying by his truck. "Those are Fresno scrapers. My father bought them in 1920. They're what built the Panama Canal. We're going to need them for the rock slide up ahead. I could use another hand." Eli looked at his great-uncle. His face weathered like an old boot, his eyes clear and certain. He looked at the mules, standing patiently in the heat, their ears twitching at the flies. And for the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt in the confident world of Carl Jessup and his charts. He stayed. He didn't say yes. He just picked up a heavy chain and started untangling it. "Let me tell you about the work." It was a lesson in the physics of patience. With Eli helping, they could now work 2 teams of mules. They reached the Great Rock Slide of 1954 in the second week of July. It was a formidable obstacle, a wall of rock and earth, 300 yards long and, in places 20 feet high, completely obliterating the old trace. This was where the real work began. They used the Fresno scrapers. A Fresno was a simple, brutal tool, a heavy iron scoop, about 4 feet wide. The mules would drag it into the loose rock. Eli or Hiram would lift the handle at the back, forcing the blade to dig in and fill the scoop with a cubic yard of earth and rock, a weight of nearly 2,000 pounds. Then the mules would strain, their powerful hindquarters digging into the dirt, and drag the load to the downhill side of the path and dump it. It was back-breaking, repetitive, dangerous work. A misplaced foot could mean a crushed leg. A spooked mule could send tons of rock tumbling. They measured their progress not in miles but in feet. Some days they would clear only 10 feet of the path. The temperature hit 108 degrees. The valley was now in stage 2 rationing. Bill McRae's main well had gone dry. He was having one of his stock tanks filled by a water truck from Clayton every 2 days, at a cost of $600. He had to sell off a third of his herd at a loss. The anxiety in the valley was palpable. It had become a quiet, desperate place. People stopped making small talk at the post office. Every conversation was about the heat, the dust, the cost of water, the failing wells. Carl Jessup's plan for the deep well was moving forward, but the bond vote was still a month away, and the drilling itself wouldn't even start until the spring. His solution was a year away. The valley didn't have a year. It had weeks. A few other ranchers started to drift out to the rockslide, drawn by a kind of morbid curiosity. They'd park their trucks and watch from a distance as Hiram and Eli and the teams of mules worked in a rhythmic cycle of scrape, pull, and dump. They saw the intelligence of the system. Hiram was using all 40 mules, but in rotation. A team of 4 would work for an hour, then rest in the shade while another team took its place. He was managing their energy, their hydration, their health, with the same care a general would manage an army. One afternoon, Bill McRae came out. He didn't say anything. He just watched for an hour as Hiram, a 78-year-old man, and his 22-year-old nephew moved more rock in an afternoon than a crew with shovels could move in a week. He watched as Hiram used a long iron bar as a lever to pry loose a boulder the size of a hay bale, positioning it just so, until gravity did the work and it rolled harmlessly down the slope. There was no wasted motion. It was an economy of effort born of a lifetime of physical work. McRae got back in his truck and left. The next morning, he returned. He brought a 50-gallon water tank in the bed of his truck for the mules. He didn't offer to help. He just parked it in the shade and said, "Figured you could use this." Hiram nodded. "Thanks, Bill." That was all that was said. But it was a turning point. The scoffing had turned into watching. The watching was beginning to turn into a fragile, unspoken hope. They broke through the last of the rockslide on August 10th. It had taken them nearly a month to clear 300 yards. The path ahead was easier, just overgrown brush and smaller rocks. Eli now worked with a quiet intensity. He had lost 15 pounds. His hands were calloused and strong. He had learned the names and personalities of all 40 mules. He understood the quiet language Hiram used to command them. He had stopped thinking about spreadsheets. They reached the location of the spring on the afternoon of August 14th. It wasn't dramatic. There was no gushing fountain. The spot was a tangle of willow and cottonwood, greener than the surrounding landscape, but the ground was just damp, dark earth. The Ojo Caliente Seco was, as Jessup's maps had suggested, just a seep. The flow was barely a trickle. Eli's heart sank. After all this work, for nothing. He looked at his great-uncle. Had he been wrong all along? Hiram showed no disappointment. He walked around the seep, his eyes on the ground, reading the geology. "The water's here," he said, his voice calm. "It's just blocked. The flood that caused the big slide must have choked the opening with silt." He brought over a team of mules with a drag shovel and began to carefully scrape away the layers of mud and gravel from the base of a rock ledge. He worked with the precision of a surgeon, clearing a few inches at a time. After an hour of careful digging, he uncovered the original opening of the spring, a fissure in the rock no wider than a man's hand. From it, a stream of water, clear and steady, began to flow. It wasn't a torrent. It was a stream you could block with your hand. Eli looked at it. "It's not much," he said. Hiram dipped a tin cup into the flow and drank. He handed the cup to Eli. The water was cool and sweet. "Patience," Hiram said. "The pressure's been blocked for 30 years. It needs time to clear its throat." They worked for 2 more days, building a small collection basin out of flat stones and clay, a pool about 10 feet wide and 3 feet deep. They cleared a channel for the overflow to run into the head of the old trace. The flow from the spring slowly, steadily increased as decades of built-up pressure found release. By the 3rd day, a constant stream, the width of a stovepipe, was flowing out of the basin and down the cleared path. Let me tell you about the physics of that path. The 15-degree slope was a work of genius. It was steep enough to keep the water moving, but shallow enough to prevent erosion. The water flowed down the 78-mile channel they had cleared, a silver ribbon snaking through the parched landscape. It took almost 24 hours for the first trickle of water to reach the valley floor. Hiram and Eli followed its progress on foot. They walked the trace, clearing small blockages, shoring up the sides of the channel. Behind them, the mules followed, freed from their harnesses, walking with the slow, deliberate gait of creatures who had done their job. The water arrived at the end of the trace, a spot that emptied into a dry stock pond on Bill McRae's land, at 4:15 p.m. on August 17th. McRae was there. He had seen the dark line of wet earth creeping down the last half-mile of the trail. He stood by the cracked, dusty bed of his pond and watched as the first fingers of water trickled in. He took off his hat and wiped his forehead with the back of his arm. He didn't say a word. He just watched the water flow. By the next morning, the news was all over the valley. A crowd began to gather. Ranchers in their dusty pickups, townspeople in their cars. They parked along the county road and walked up to McRae's pond. It was a quarter full. A steady, uninterrupted stream of clear water was pouring into it. Carl Jessup arrived around 10 a.m. He came in his official county truck. He was a professional. He was here to see the situation for himself. He was skeptical, but he was also a man of science, and he had brought his equipment. He carried a Marsh McBurney Flowmate 2000, a professional-grade flow meter. He walked up to the channel where the water poured into the pond. The crowd of 50 or 60 people went silent. Hiram Stone was there, standing off to one side, Eli beside him. Hiram was watching the water, not the people. Jessup unpacked his equipment. He calibrated the sensor. He waded into the channel, which was now about 2 feet wide and 6 inches deep, and placed the sensor in the swiftest part of the current. He held it steady, his eyes on the digital readout in his hand. The silence stretched. The only sounds were the gurgle of the water and the cry of a hawk circling high in the cloudless, brassy sky. Everyone was looking at Jessup. He stood there for a full minute, his expression unreadable. He rechecked the placement of the sensor. He stared at the readout. Bill McRae finally broke the silence. "Well, what's it say, Carl?" Carl Jessup looked up from the device. He looked at the crowd. He looked over at Hiram Stone, who met his gaze without expression. He cleared his throat. 450 gallons a minute. The number hung in the air for a moment. People were doing the math in their heads. 450 gallons a minute. That was 27,000 gallons an hour. That was 648,000 gallons a day. The valley's total daily water usage, even in a normal year, was only 500,000 gallons. A single person started to clap. Then another. Then the entire crowd erupted in a roar of cheers and applause that echoed off the dry hills. It wasn't just a cheer for the water. It was a cheer for the old man and his 40 sway-backed mules, for the stubborn, quiet refusal to accept that the old ways were dead. Carl Jessup waded out of the stream. He walked over to Hiram Stone. The crowd quieted, watching them. The consultant, the man with the data and the charts, stood before the old rancher in his worn-out hat. He held out his hand. "Mr. Stone," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I was wrong." Hiram looked at the outstretched hand. He took it. It was not a handshake of triumph, but of mutual, weary respect. "I just cleared a public right-of-way," he said. "The water did the rest." The aftermath was quiet and profound. The bond issue for the new well was voted down, 312 to 14. The water from the Ojo Caliente Seco filled McRae's pond, then was channeled into a series of interconnected stock tanks and ditches, a gravity-fed system that watered the entire lower valley. The drought didn't break until the following spring, but the valley survived. No one had to sell their herds. No one had to abandon their homes. The cost of Hiram's project was tallied. It came to $9,450 in hay and oats for the mules over 4 months, and the labor of one old man and one young one. The proposed well would have cost $42 million plus interest, and would have further depleted the aquifer. Hiram Stone never took a penny for his work. When the county commission tried to give him a plaque, he refused it. "The mules did the work," he said, "and the land showed the way. I just listened." Eli went back to college that fall, but he was a different person. He changed his major from agricultural business to range and soil science. He spent his weekends and summers with Hiram, learning not just how to work the mules, but how to read the land, how to understand its deep, slow history. When Hiram passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1995 at the age of 85, Eli inherited the ranch, the clapboard house, and the care of the remaining mules. He didn't run the ranch in the modern way. He kept a smaller herd of cattle. He established the Cimarron Trace Conservancy, a nonprofit funded by small donations from the ranchers who now depended on it. Every year, he and a crew of volunteers would take the new generation of mules and walk the 78-mile path, clearing brush, shoring up the channel, ensuring the water would always have a clear path to the valley. The trace became a living part of the community, a reminder of their near-death experience. Carl Jessup finished his contract with the county and moved to a job in California. Before he left, he published a paper in a professional hydrology journal. It was titled, Case Study of the Ojo Caliente Seco, Integrating Folk Knowledge and Modern Measurement in Arid Land Water Management. It was a quiet, academic admission that his models had been incomplete, that his data had been blind to a solution that was older than his science. What survives is not always what is strongest, or what is most efficient. The powerful diesel pumps, the deep wells, the complex irrigation systems, they were strong, but they were brittle. They depended on a single source, the aquifer, and when that source faltered, the whole system collapsed. The old way, the mules, the trace, the gravity-fed spring, was inefficient, slow and laborious. But it was resilient. It was adapted to the harsh realities of the land, not to the optimistic assumptions of a few good years. It bent, but it did not break. In the end, the story is not about mules defeating tractors, or an old man defeating an expert. It is about two different kinds of knowledge. One is the knowledge of the spreadsheet of the dataset, which is powerful and broad but sees only the recent past. The other is the knowledge of the land itself, passed down through generations, which is narrow and deep and remembers the droughts the data has forgotten. The valley survived because, at the last possible moment, it learned to listen to both.